Two of our readings for today urge God's people to live righteously in relation to other people. Doing this, not adhering to particular worship forms, addresses the heart of what God wants. Our Gospels reading for today comes from Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, as recorded in Matthew 5 through 7. This is perhaps the most notable and challenging sermon ever delivered. So no pressure on your amateur preacher as he comments on it today. In verse 17 of chapter 5, Jesus says, "He has not come to abolish the law of Moses, but to fulfill it." And in the latter portion of chapter 5, he describes some key rules of the Mosaic law and deepens them from being rules about people's external behavior to principles about their innermost thoughts. Expect details in future sermons. But before this, Jesus begins his famous sermon with the Beatitudes. They're called this because each starts with a blessed, followed by a description of some attitudes and behaviors. In its Hebrew context, the word means deeply happy or fortunate. The Beatitudes can be hard to grasp if we read them merely as generally applicable principles of moral instruction. Why is that? Well, several of the attitudes or circumstances that Jesus describes are generally associated with unhappiness. But many of us have heard these words and ideas so often that we may miss the irony or the surprise that Jesus' original audience likely felt when they heard what Jesus said. So understanding the Beatitudes requires that we grasp their historical setting. Here, near the beginning of Jesus' earthly ministry, Jesus is announcing and delivering in his person the return of God's rule. Let that sink in for a minute. Jesus is not merely a moral teacher. He is Israel's promised Messiah. He is the means by which God will bless all people. And when we put the Beatitudes in that context, we can recognize that Jesus is setting out the nearly incomprehensible joy for those participating in God's long anticipated return to rule. Put differently, Jesus is not merely offering some generalized truths about human life applicable to all circumstances. He's not merely telling people, try to cultivate these ideas and live like this. Instead, Jesus is announcing that God is taking big steps to right the wrongness of his people's current situation. He invites them and us to come alongside him to make this happen. Jesus demands that his audience and we renew our minds in ways that will show that we are God's people. Jesus sets out 8 attitudes or behaviors that he says yield deep joy. He repeats the 8th with a slightly different wording and with an additional blessing. So depending on how you count the Beatitudes, you might consider them to number 9. But whether 8 or 9, Jesus teaches that these persons will be happy because of what God will do for them. 3 of the 8 Beatitudes mirror some ideas in our reading from the prophets today, Micah 6. And we'll see this as we discuss particular Beatitudes. To help our focus, I've divided the 8 Beatitudes into 3 subdivisions. The promised blessing start and end the same way, with God extending the kingdom of heaven. So let's talk about the first subdivision. What are the attitudes and behaviors that Jesus says at the beginning of the Beatitudes will be blessed. Well, it's important to understand that this first subdivision's characteristics are not typically seen as consistent with blessing. Many in Jesus' day and ours would regard them as negative. Why is that? Because most are associated with the poor. Most of us are not poor, but we have something to learn from what Jesus says in this subdivision. And two of the Beatitudes in this subdivision mirror what the prophet Micah says in chapter 6 of his book. In important ways, Jesus begins the Beatitudes in the fashion similar to the sermon that he preached in his hometown at the start of his ministry, as recorded in Luke chapter 4. You'll remember that there, reading from Isaiah 61, Jesus pronounces a blessing simply on the poor, not the poor in spirit. And of course, that's how he starts the Beatitudes. His Old Testament text seems to provide at least the first two Beatitudes in Matthew 5 as well. What are those words from Isaiah 61? The Lord has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim freedom for the captives and release from darkness for the prisoners, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor and the day of vengeance of our God, to comfort all who mourn and provide for those who grieve in Zion. In the Beatitudes, but not in his reading in Luke, Jesus proclaims good news for those not merely poor, but poor in spirit. But we shouldn't read too much into this distinction, because the financially poor usually are poor both in pocketbook and self-esteem. And those of us here, and this applies to most of us, with ample material blessings, need to remember the Bible's many warnings about mistaken reliance on our prosperity, not least the warning from 1 Timothy 6 that the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. So the second beatitude, for those who mourn, may stem from the brokenheartedness awaiting the slowness of God's delivery of justice, as in Isaiah 61. And similarly, the third beatitude describes the meekness of the oppressed who await God's deliverance. This beatitude describes a reversal of fortune for the downtrodden. It partially quotes Psalm 37, verse 11, where we read, "The meek will inherit the land and enjoy peace and prosperity." Two verses before that, in that same psalm, we get more of an identification of who the meek are intended to be. There in verse 9, we read, "For evil men will be cut off, but those whose hope in the Lord will inherit the land." How about this fourth beatitude? I've included the fourth one about hungering and thirsting with the first subdivision. Our translations usually render the word here righteousness, and so we typically think of this verse as a reference to personal good behavior. But in the original language, the word also means justice. So I've put this translation in brackets on this slide. Context and Jesus' apparent reliance on Isaiah 61 suggests this rendering, and it is followed in some English translations, including the New Century Version of 2005. So in sum, in this first subdivision of the first four of the 8 or 9 Beatitudes, Jesus is announcing that God will fulfill the messianic promises to all these distressed people, the humble, the broken, the meek, and justice deprived. Probably most of the folks in Jesus' audience. They chafe at Roman rule. Let's talk about the consequences for those in this subdivision of the downtrodden. Jesus assures God's blessing to them. And these blessings fulfill expectations about how the Messiah would restore justice and righteousness. God grants these blessings as a matter of grace in his coming kingdom as part of his rule. And perhaps God blesses those in this first subdivision because they don't really have any choice but to rely on him. So the humble, or as your translation may render it, the poor in spirit, receive the kingdom of heaven. The poor in spirit, get in.
You need to unmute the TV now, I think.
Those in mourning, get in. To address their brokenness, God.
Oh, wait. It's unmuted.
The meek receive the earth as their blessing. And those seeking
Or is it yours?
righteousness or justice will have it abundantly. God grants these blessings as a matter of grace in his coming kingdom as part of his rule. But what did Jesus mean by these words? And do we see the tension between the phrases that this slide places in quotation marks? Up there at the top, you'll see of heaven. And in the third bullet, the earth. Jesus would make clear at his trial before Pilate in John 18 that his kingdom was not of this world. So how can he deliver on his assurance that the meek will inherit the earth? Meantime, in what sense do the poor, to which Jesus refers, have some share in his heavenly kingdom? And given their messianic expectations, why would they count that as good news? Jesus provides a clue later in this sermon in the opening lines of his model prayer. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Heaven is God's space close to and interlocking with the earthly realm we see. Jesus is saying that with God's right rule through him as Messiah, the just and true space of God's heaven will become more and more visible to his human creatures here on earth. God's humble people receive God's true rule. That's what Jesus means by receiving the kingdom of heaven. Jews of Jesus' time resisted pronouncing God's name because they considered it sacred. And for this reason, because heaven is the place from which God rules, in heaven may simply be a circumlocution for God, not necessarily a reference to the afterlife. Thus, the blessing for the poor in spirit likely means simply that they should be happy because they can receive God's rule at its full restoration. They will enjoy the promised inheritance in the renewed place of God's good creation. And these are deep truths that require more time to explain adequately than we have this morning. But meantime, Jesus says his followers should joyfully recognize what God is doing. How about this second subdivision? The next three Beatitudes describe persons who are not necessarily downtrodden. And so it's easier to see how these words readily apply to us. The happiness that God brings to those in this subdivision thus call all of us to deeper faithfulness. This first one is that all should show mercy because they have received it from God. Can you hear the echo from Micah chapter 6? The merciful contrast with the oppressors who mistreat those in the first subdivision. And so Jesus here teaches, look, don't be the oppressor. But more than that, he says, when you're wrong, be merciful. And in this, his message mirrors Micah's. What about the second beatitude? the one about those who are pure in heart. Who are they? Those whose good behavior results from more than a desire to live within the rules. The pure in heart have an inner core motivating their good behavior. And then this last one, peacemakers. By urging peacemaking, Jesus appears to be reacting to the widespread Jewish expectations about how God would restore Israel when the Messiah arrived. The prevailing view of Jews in Jesus' time seems to have associated the coming of the Messiah with a violent restoration of Israel's independence. Many were thinking that Messiah would eject the Roman authorities. They thought that God would console Israel by inflicting wounds on others. And the New Testament repeatedly describes how Jews of Jesus' time expected this. Here's maybe my favorite. So after they've walked with Jesus during his entire earthly ministry, after they've seen him crucified and then resurrected, what happens when Jesus has his final encounter with his apostles in the first chapter of Acts? Anybody remember this verse? As he's giving the apostles their final instruction, they say, Lord, are you at this time going to restore the kingdom to Israel? Even after all that, they still expected a violent restoration of Israel's independence. Instead of violence against Roman oppressors, Jesus urges peacemaking here and in many other passages. Indeed, later in this very sermon, in chapter 5, verse 44, he directed his hearers to love your enemies, as Jesus would personally demonstrate by submitting to an unjust Roman execution. Taking up arms against the Roman overlords was not God's way. So what are the consequences for those who have the blessed attitudes in this second group? Well, the merciful receive mercy. And in this, as in so many of the Beatitudes, there is an Old Testament root. Anybody remember this verse from Proverbs 14:21? Blessed is the one who is kind to the needy. And how about this one from Psalm 24, verses 3 and 4? It seems to be the Old Testament precursor for the beatitude about the pure in heart. He who has clean hands and a pure heart is the one who may stand in the Lord's holy place. Jesus seems to build on that idea to suggest that at the end of time, such people will see God's face. But this last beatitude, the one about peacemakers, lacks a clear Old Testament basis. Instead, Jesus' own personal example provides the model for the conclusion. He demonstrated his family likeness with gentleness, mercy, purity of purpose, and peacemaking. He thus is rightly recognized as God's Son. And he says that those who demonstrate that family likeness will, like him, be called sons of God, counted as among God's children. God's people will not inherit the earth by pursuing vengeance or defeating their enemies in battle. When God's people seek justice, they must pursue it with mercy. They will prevail not through violence, but through meekness and peacemaking. So, how should we conform our attitudes to the behaviors to the ones Jesus described here? when we are wrong, we should extend mercy by readily granting forgiveness. We should examine our motives for what we do. Do our actions stem from a desire consistent with God's purposes? Jesus' brother James, in chapter 4, verse 8 of his book, warns us against being double-minded. And the remedy, he says, is to purify our hearts from this, finding single-minded devotion to the good. And then lastly, in this second group, we should seek to resolve conflicts, particularly those in which we are involved. As Paul writes, let us therefore make every effort to do what leads to peace and to mutual edification. That's in Romans 14, verse 19. Well, let's talk for a moment about subdivision 3. Righteousness. We see again a reference to those who are hungry to live that way. And at the end of the Beatitudes, an explanation that those who live righteously sometimes are persecuted for that very reason. This overlaps with that fourth beatitude that we talked about in subdivision 1, those who hunger for righteousness or justice. The final beatitude refers to those whose behavior has been righteous and yet suffer for it. Before, during, and after Jesus' time, God's people sometimes suffer precisely for their goodness or their loyalty to God. Jesus notes in this chapter that the prophets suffered in that way. He tells his audience that persons who loyally follow him should expect their opponents to say false and evil things about them and to insult them. The appropriate response is not retribution. Instead, when this happens, those suffering this persecution should, Jesus says in chapter 5, verse 44, part of this same sermon, pray for their opponents and rejoice that they are experiencing suffering similarly to the prophets. Doing this is obviously profoundly hard in the moment, but Jesus calls us to do this as we recognize how God is bringing his rule into our earthly realm. What are the consequences for people who have the characteristics of this third group of beatitudes? As again, promised blessing can be seen as surprising, especially for those in this third subdivision as in the first. Like the poor, the persecuted get it. Perhaps God blesses them because, like the first, they must rely on God. Jesus repeats the blessing on those persecuted for their righteous loyalty to God in the 9th beatitude and shifts to the second person. He's been talking about this in third person, but then he looks the audience in the eye and he says, blessed are you when you suffer these things. Jesus' audience can share in the joy of the arrival of God's rule, and an unspecified future blessing also belongs to them. God will vindicate his people who live righteously. They may suffer now, but their hunger for doing right will yield a great reward when God's will is done on earth as it is in heaven. So summing up, here are the things we've looked at this morning from the Beatitudes. And as you have seen, with a little precursor in Micah chapter 6. Jesus says, toward God, you've got to be humble, penitent, meek, pure in heart, and eager to live rightly. And with respect to other people, you need to act justly and with mercy. You should make peace, and you should be righteous, even if persecution results. As God's people, we should live just and good lives. We should do this even when persecution results. Violently opposing those who mistreat us does not yield the blessing of which Jesus speaks. Instead, despite persecution, we must foster peace. This is one way that others can recognize us as God's children. God will vindicate and bless those who humbly rely on him. His assurance of this enables them to be supremely happy even in their current circumstance. This is Jesus' point in the Beatitudes. And Micah 6 mirrors part of this idea. Through Jesus, God is establishing his rule to provide the means for these blessings. These blessings are not earned. In his grace, God bestows them. From having the attitudes and actions Jesus details, we are no more entitled to these blessings than those who offered the sacrifices prescribed by Moses. And you'll remember what Micah said about that. Each of us as individuals must decide whether to place ourselves under the mighty lordship of gentle Jesus, the promised Messiah. We do this initially by symbolically dying to ourselves when we are buried in the waters of baptism. Two of our elders will be in the back this morning, and I in the front as we join in singing our next hymn. And please let us know if this congregation can help you with this important step. And after that, we'll gather at the table in front to celebrate together as we renew our commitment to Jesus' body by eating and drinking this meal together, sharing the bread symbolizing his body and drinking the juice symbolizing his blood. God bless us all as we continue to cultivate the attitudes and actions that he desires.